Hey, folks, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Today, we're going to another Carolina. We visited South Carolina for the first time in, I think, our last episode, if not pretty recently. And this time, we're going to North Carolina. And to talk with us about a very specific distillery, Southern Grace Distilleries, we have Thomas Thacker. Thomas, welcome on.
Thank you for having me, David. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So, as I said, this is a new state for us. We haven't talked to anyone who's been producing, let alone distilling in North Carolina before. So, we'll definitely talk a little bit about that. But I wanted to start off, as we always do, by opening it up to you to tell about the origin story. And I do also want to mention that while we are recording, and I'll post about this before the episode goes live and, in a more timely manner, that right now you're about to celebrate your 10th anniversary, the distillery's 10th anniversary, October 4th through 6th. So hopefully I'll post about that and get some more people to visit and take a look at it. So with that, I'll throw it over to you for the origin story of Southern Grace Distilleries.
Well, thank you, David. It's an honor to be the first North Carolina distillery featured here. As a very small distillery, we have learned the importance of people who host podcasts and do reviews of small distilleries, and it's a big deal for us to get to do this because you bring a credibility to the conversation that we literally can't pay for. And I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be here. A little bit about us. We turned our stills on October 5th, 10 years ago. Jesus, it really was 10 years ago. So I guess that was 2014. Uh, my dearest my dearest friend at the time, Leanne Powell, and I had worked together several other ways. We'd done some consulting together. We'd been in politics together, and we were looking for something we could do that was where you meet a better class of people than you do in politics. And the liquor business sort of came up in that conversation. We started with our first product was Sundog 130. It's an authentic, high proof North Carolina moonshine, and from there, the natural progression for corn whiskeys is into bourbon, the aged product. So we moved into a facility that was big enough to accommodate that. Labor Day weekend of 2016, we moved to Mount Pleasant, North Carolina, where we were welcomed and really was a good move for us from a community involvement standpoint. We moved in a Labor Day weekend of 2016, and we put down our first barrel of conviction bourbon in January of 2017. Just a minute or two about our product. It's an 88 corn, 12 malted barley. We're a very Piedmont, North Carolina focused grain bill. I believe that people do best the things that they've always done for generations, and we handle corn here. We drink corn here. Other places that grow other grains have indigenous grain supplies, do great jobs in other grains. We didn't see any need to try to do what other people were already doing well, when the moonshining tradition in the part of the world that we come from is very focused on corn. And that's kind of where we planted our flag at the 8812. I love rise and high rise. I love wheateds. I also love a lot of corn. So we've that's what we do, and structurally, flavor profile, nose, et cetera, et cetera. Our whiskey is a very, very good example of what high corn brings to bourbon. In the same way that other people are making their statement with 4 grain or 3 grain, we're making ours with 2 grain, and hope that it will find a spot with discerning people such as yourself, that we're different on purpose, but we think that it's different in a good way, and in a way that fits into the broader market.
Wonderful. And I'll say, just for disclaimer's sake, so you were generous enough to share 2 of your products with me, the Conviction Straight Bourbon, as well as a Conviction single barrel that was chosen for National Bourbon Heritage Month in 2024, both of which I really enjoyed. I'll have tasting notes up for them. We could talk about them, more in depth a little bit later as well. So the first place I want to go is just the state of North Carolina. As I said, I'm not particularly familiar with the distilling history there, or distilling scene as it is right now. And you did mention a Piedmont style mash bill of that 8812. So, what does the North Carolina distilling scene look like right now?
It is very active. It is growing. Our association is growing. I don't know the numbers in growth, but it's insane. Just in the decade that we've been in business, the association has gone from literally something like 12 or 15 to 45 or 50. And we've been very fortunate in this state. The craft brewers and the wineries sort of set the market and kick the door down a little bit to get the distilleries in the game. They sort of showed us that you can be small, you can find your niche, you can drive tourism to cash flow your production. There are a lot of things that those other spirit related but not distilled spirit related industries have been very successful in North Carolina, and I think that kind of set the tone for the growth on the distillery side. There are permits that are pending across the state, and it's a dynamic and diverse group of people. There are various grain bills, some aged products. There are great gins. There are other really good corn whiskeys out there. Several good bourbon distilleries. So it's I encourage. First, I would love for everybody to come see us at Southern Grace Distilleries, to come to Whiskey Prison and see what we have and taste what we make. But there is a burgeoning statewide distillery economy here, any one of which can give you good tours and good tastings, and hitting several of them in a day is a good idea to come to North Carolina and see what we got going on.
Fantastic. And so, North Carolina is, we should say, from the retail side, it's a control state. So you got ABC stores around the state, and I know you've been pretty successful in getting into 75-80% of those stores. And that being said, so you said that the brewing and wine industry set the path so that distilleries could, for lack of a better way to put it, could operate sooner and easier than perhaps otherwise they could, or they have in other states. You've also said in the past, you want to put North Carolina distilling on the map, make it a state that's known, just like Kentucky, Tennessee, Texas, New York, known for distilling whiskey, whether it's white dog or aged. So as we stand right now, what kind of, did North Carolina have any legal limitations on distilling, and what things remain as limitations?
Our we've been very beneficial. It's been very beneficial to us here. Governor Cooper and the ABC regime under him has, and the legislature, to their credit, has loosened some of the regulations that make it a little easier for us to be viable on the property side. We can do bottle sales now. You can get a mixed bev license within a distillery and have a proper bar to present your products to people. And there's been this, it's an interesting field to be in, because a lot, there's just a natural sort of resistance to distilled spirits, to alcohol in general. But I think that our state, through some really good leadership in Raleigh, has begun to see more the advantage, the economic advantage, the cultural advantage to what the distilling industry brings to it. And we're still not on regulatory equal footing with our brothers and sisters in the beer and wine business. And I think that's an ultimate goal for us, is to not be shackled by proof point for some of these things. But things are so much better than they have been, and I foresee them getting better, because every North Carolina distiller that I know, every distillery that I go to, they serve responsibly, they manufacture responsibly. That whatever problems people perceive to be in the distilled spirits world, they're not happening at craft distillers, and they're certainly not happening at any of the craft distillers that I visit in our state. And I think that the sort of the opening of the minds to the benefits as we grow, as we get bigger, as we hire more people and pay more taxes and do more business, people see that we are not in any way a detriment, and in fact are bringing bringing a lot of positives to the community and to the state. And I think that the fact that we're getting it right and that our politicians and government officials are being open-minded enough to see that we're getting it right are lending itself to a bright regulatory future here. And if I can, just one thing about the ABC system. A lot of people rail about control states, and all governments and all bureaucracies have their problems. But for a very small producer such as ourselves, there are some protections built in to being a control state. And if we've tried to do business in states that weren't control states, that's no picnic either, where people can do things within the market to take up the shelf space, to squeeze you out, to drive down the price point to where a very small distillery can't produce enough units to compete. So it's our system certainly has its flaws. I would say that all systems have flaws. So there's being a control state from a consumer standpoint, and I love to go in a liquor store and wander around and buy the cool stuff. And sometimes that can get frustrating in a control state. But as a very small producer, the control state here actually provides some protections for us that kind of make it a trade-off for the downside.
That's a fair way to put it. It's not something that we think about all the time as a control state being a good thing or a positive for a distillery, but you're right. It can help. They often are interested in their own state's distilleries and products, and they want to push them forward a little more. And
Correct.
It's a lot easier for them to do it than if you're working with a huge distributor where you're a minuscule part of their portfolio. No offense meant, of course, by that statement, but where you're just a very small part of their portfolio and they're interested in selling the big guys who are going to do tons of volume.
Correct.
So it's very different. And so just continuing with the origin story too, I wanted to ask you about the name Southern Grace, where that came from.
We kind of had a coin flip. We had product designs and name ideas and sort of a marketing strategy around two different names, one of which was Southern Grace. And we went back and forth, and it was sort of, liked them both. And then one of our dear friends had a daughter during this point of discussion, and with no connection to the whiskey conversation, named their daughter Grace. And then my brother had his daughter, and her middle name was Grace. So that we were just I hate to admit that a distilled spirits company was named after two toddlers, but that's the fact. We just Leanne and I were back and forth, and it was sort of a 1-to-1 vote every time, and we had two wonderful Graces come into our life, so we settled on Southern Grace, and that was the start. That was the deciding factor in the name.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I know, just off the top of my head, I mean, Michter's big brand. Everyone thinks is a German name. It's named after Michael and Peter, two of the an early owner's sons.
Right.
So yeah, nothing wrong with that. And I asked this also because, as we'll get into, your production and everything is located in a former prison. And so at first I thought, and of course, the bourbons are named Conviction. So I thought at first maybe there's like a Southern Grace, like, a kind of Southern Forgiveness, or a nice version of the Bless Your Heart kind of thing, if you will. But no, I think that's a fine origin of the name as well.
And that was how Grace got in the mix to start with. It was that it wasn't connected to the prison yet, but it was connected to that notion because of Southern of Grace, and the other ones were Charm, Southern Charm. Is it that we're Southern people, have worked and lived our whole lives in the American South and love it, and that sort of bless their heart kind of notion, as Lynn was always saying, bless their heart, especially when she was angry enough at someone to say something else, she would say bless their heart. So that your origin story is correct. The having the two wonderful Graces drop into our lives was just the deciding factor, but it did start from exactly the point that you're suggesting.
Gotcha. So I want to again still with the origin story and your initial setup. So you come from a background of bartending, of working on the, let's say, the on-premise side of things. I know you proudly, and should be proudly, say that you've been able to work at some places where they really cared about the education of their staff. And to me, there
Yeah.
is,
Go
there is
ahead.
of course a jump between being on that side and going into the distilling side. So how did you make that jump?
It's something that we always talk about. We are grain to glass on our facility, but in fact that's backwards. We're glass to grain. We start with the empty cocktail glass because that's where your customer lives, and the rest of the story is fun and it's interesting. The process can be fascinating to some people, but the fact is that for 99.9% of us, the joy of a distilled spirit is in a properly made cocktail home or bar. And so I brought to bear decades of sitting and listening to people drink things they enjoyed, talking about what they did or didn't like and why they did or didn't like it, and just kind of compiling that inventory of other people's opinions about distilled spirits and about bourbons and whiskeys. So, and I knew, and I want to mention, I don't know when this will air, but we're in North Carolina right now, west of here, uh, dealing with the horrific aftermath of Hurricane Helene, and people in the North Carolina mountains were really where I learned how to distill their great traditional, though not quite legal, moonshining traditions all up and down the North Carolina mountains and really across the entire state. And I was working in a restaurant that had a very very high end bar clientele, great inventory, and the owner would do tastings. He would book people to come in and do tastings. This was 25 years ago. This was before it got to be all the rage to do, but he would educate his staff. He taught us, things that we didn't know. He exposed us to people who knew more even than he did. And at the same time, I was hanging out with and talking to, socializing with people who were making, corn liquor in the woods. And I was fascinated to connect those dots between this thing that is made in these blue buckets using creek water to costing 75, 100, $200 a bottle when it gets to the bar. And that middle ground became fascinating to me. And with this company, we were able to actually connect those dots.
Gotcha. Yes, we. I do want to, as you said, to note that right now North Carolina is definitely, especially the western part of the state, as you said, is really going through it with the aftermath of Hurricane Helene. Um, I don't have a date off the top of my head, but when I post about the weekend that's coming up as we're recording, I'll also put up a note about where people can donate or reach out to help for people in the area, because I know it was hit particularly badly in the mountains. So the mountains in the west, similar to eastern Tennessee, are where a lot of moonshining happened over the years, and still continues to happen. If we're being honest, I don't know any states or places for it, so no one come after me for names, but uh, it's certainly a tradition and lifestyle that has gone on for hundreds of years in those areas. Now, when you were moving over and becoming, deciding to become a distiller and build a distillery, that you were going to do everything from scratch. I'm curious, in addition to the historical inspiration that you had from that, if you had any uh, either inspiration or guidance from perhaps particular figures in the whiskey industry, and that can be either in North Carolina or nationally.
And more just the great products and the great distilleries, and of course, certainly from Kentucky. I mean, it's the definitional American spirit, and I'm not one of these people who gets all up in their feels because people want to talk about Kentucky when they're at our place talking about our bourbon. It's impossible to talk about bourbon and not talk about Kentucky in the same way it's impossible to talk about baseball and not talk about the Yankees. It makes no sense at all to act like it doesn't exist. And I embrace it, and my house is full of Kentucky bourbons. So more so than any individual in the industry, it was the quality, the years of pleasure that I've taken from drinking and sharing good bourbons with my friend. And for us, we're out here in North Carolina. We're out of the center of it all, but that doesn't mean that we can't do it. And those distilleries were an inspiration for us. And any great sip you've ever had, for me, uh, leads me to what we're trying to do, because that's where the tradition is, that's where the standard is, and we're proud and happy to be part of it. And the biggest thrill I can get is when somebody says that our stuff is as good to them as another bourbon in the industry that I really love and respect. So I wouldn't name a person, but I would just the bourbon tradition and the welcoming nature of people who are thousands of times larger than us and have reputations and finances, beyond our dreams. And still, when you bump into them at a convention or at a tasting or at any event, they put their arm around you. They've got something for you to taste that isn't on the regular table. It is, in a lot of ways, it is a fellowship, and that's the real inspiration for me, and wanting to be a really good bourbon, because I know if you're not a really good bourbon, everybody will know it and they'll drink something else.
It's a fair point. The consumer ultimately is the decider. So with that, I want to push a little bit further just on one of those points, which was in I hear what you're saying in terms of people come and they want to compare you to Kentucky bourbon. I agree. It's kind of inevitable. They do it here in New York, if in California, everywhere. It just happens. It's like if you have a single malt, they're going to compare it to Scotch. So keeping that in mind, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on whether conviction bourbon is more designed to be a North Carolina bourbon, or rather a bourbon made in North Carolina, if that makes sense.
Yes, and for me, that's a conversation that we have quite often internally, and it's one that I have in my head every day. Is that which would you rather be? I would hope that, and this happens quite frequently, that if you take a bottle of conviction to an event where bourbon's made not only from Kentucky, but Texas or New York or anywhere else that people are making really interesting bourbons, that if you taste us, that you're not judging us against our peers in North Carolina. I hope that we're able to defend ourselves at a tasting of anyone in the industry. So from that standard, from a quality standard, from an expectation of our product standard, we're not limited to comparisons within North Carolina. We want to be as good as what you drink, no matter what that is or where it came from. But realistically, our primary market is North Carolina and South Carolina. And so we have to be ever mindful of the local market, the local standard, and the local expectations. So we don't want to be one or the other, but we need to figure out how to be both simultaneously.
Gotcha. So it's really telling playing both sides, and that has a negative connotation. Let me think of a better phrase than that. Let's go with that.
We could go to a tasting somewhere and win a tasting against North Carolina products, and that's a great thing. If somebody says you're the best bourbon in North Carolina, that's a really good thing to hear someone say. That doesn't mean that I want to be less favorably considered if there are 3 Kentucky bourbons in the tasting. And that's the thing. I'm not conceding the ground that because we're working hard to be the best bourbon in North Carolina, that we don't understand that big market wise, that in the world, if you're not holding your own against Kentucky bourbons, you're never relevant.
Right. Yeah, I think that's what I was thinking of more is less about the playing both sides, but more about knowing when to tell which side of the story,
Right.
and which identity to kind of lean into. And that sounds like you got that down. Obviously, I haven't seen you in person do it, but from the way you're describing it, I can see that you obviously know how to do that. So um, the so the next thing I want to go at is, and you said this earlier, and I was going to bring it up, was that you came at it in a way that you had described elsewhere as kind of a backwards way, designing that whiskey from the glass to the grain as opposed from grain to glass, and designing whiskey that would work well for bartenders in particular, something that would work well in cocktails and could stand on its own, but was in some ways designed to be a cocktail bourbon, albeit an elevated one. When you were thinking about that, was that an existing hole in the market, or was that one that you kind of identified and created in order to fill?
Um, it's something that over like I said, over many years of drinking in bars and listening to other people who were drinking in bars and taking their money in exchange for what they were drinking, I just sort of I felt like there was a niche from a production side that would sort of answer the concerns and questions I had been internalizing for those decades in the trade. And people simultaneously, sometimes people uh, they select against their own choice. And what I mean by that is a lot of people will tell you they like cast strength or barrel proof, but they don't necessarily like 126 or 131 proof. So how do you fix that? You go in at a lower entry point so that your harvest point on your barrels is 101, 105, 107 instead of in the mid 120s. That way you can get a full uncut straight from the barrel experience, even if you don't love a high proof bourbon. And I do love a good high proof bourbon. Not everyone does. So that was, and leaving and not cutting it, leaving the proof point at 104, 105, 106, lets you make a classic spirit forward cocktail that doesn't wash out the characteristics of a bourbon. Even a great bourbon that's 80 or 85 proof, if you make a proper Manhattan, you've pretty much, if you're using any sort of an interesting vermouth, you've inked out an 80 proof bourbon with the vermouth. With a 100 or 105, you're getting the impact of the bourbon. It's supposed to be spirit forward. It is a bourbon centric cocktail. At the proof point that we bottle, the characteristics of the bourbon survive the cocktail treatment, because again, not everybody wants to drink their bourbon neat, and I wanted them to taste our bourbon in an old fashioned, in a Manhattan, even in a whiskey sour. Make the drink you like, you will still taste the characteristics of our bourbon in that drink.
Gotcha. So I agree with you. If you're making it a bourbon, or sorry, making a cocktail with a bourbon or even a rye at 80, 85 proof, it's kind of hard not to just overpower it with the other components. Hell, at that proof, even putting it on a cube of ice is going to dilute it pretty quickly. And if you've been drinking for any period of time, it can get lost and it can really reduce the flavor. Now, I will say I haven't tried these products in a cocktail quite yet. I don't have a ton of cocktail equipment at home, so I can only make the most basic cocktails. But I did try them straight on their own in a Glencairn, so I like to taste everything. And as I said before, I really enjoyed it, and we'll get into the a little more of the detail on your production on that. So before we do, one thing I wanted to throw out there was that you, because it rolls into the cocktail aspect of it, is that you enter your barrels at, I believe, 105. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. We do a founder's reserve that goes in at 125, but 105 is our barrel in proof for 95% of what we do.
Gotcha. Well, I may have to try that other one because that I'm just fascinated by different entry proofs. That's a fun, after the maker's DNA experiment.
I have your mailing address. We can fix that.
Oh, right. Yeah. Especially after the maker's DNA series a couple years ago, where they kind of showed the differences. That was a really exciting thing to start talking about, in addition to me talking about all the yeasts and barrels and all of that, which we'll get to as well. Now there is something to this that it not necessarily goes against, but it complicates the idea of this being a cocktail whiskey to me, which is that putting it in at a lower barrel entry proof, and 105 is a pretty low entry proof at this point. There are the only two major companies I could think of that put it in lower, that being Peerless and Makers at 103 each. Putting it in a lower barrel entry proof necessarily means that it's going to be more expensive to produce. You need more barrels, more bottles, and all this. So there is a higher cost in the balance, So while wanting to create a bourbon that can be used for cocktails and not get lost, it also has to be cheap enough to be used in a cocktail and not be overpriced. So how do you kind of square those two things between the balance sheet and the sell sheet?
It's precariously. Is that an answer?
That's a good answer. Yeah.
Yeah, it is, and it's the thing that if you're going to water it down and you don't want to drink it, I'm not going to be there when they make that one. So that will be somebody else's. But you're absolutely right. I don't think that conviction was ever intended to be on the rail. There's no need to take anything that's in the mid $40 price point and dump 6 ounces of ginger ale in it. And I drink that drink all the time. I just get a $15 bottle of bourbon to do that with. And when I was in the bar business, that was exactly what I did. If you wanted a bourbon and ginger ale, we all know what bourbons we reach for to make a bourbon and Coke or a bourbon and ginger ale. And I encourage drinking those drinks. We were never intended to be that part of anybody's cocktail program. The part that we shoot for are classic, spirit forward cocktails to where the person sitting across the bar knows good whiskey when they drink it, and they also know that they like it better in a well-constructed cocktail than they do just drinking it neat. There is a niche between the rail and the top shelf, and we're as good and as fairly priced in that range as anyone else is. And if you've got $8, get an $8 drink. If you've got $50, get a $50 drink. If you're one of us that lives in the difference between the two, have a conviction old fashioned, and you will find the value there.
I hear you, and I do look forward to trying some of these, trying each of these, I should say, in those more classic cocktails, spirit forward ones. I do want to say though that given some of the tasting notes I pulled out from each of these products, that again, the uncut, unfiltered, straight bourbon whiskey, the Conviction Original, if you will, and then the Conviction Double Oak 1929. If you don't mind the extra cost, I think it would work really well with ginger ale or a cola type thing, or even a Dr. Pepper. Like the darkness and dark fruits on the original, and especially the baking spice and ginger that came out for me on the Double Oak, I think would work very, very well. But if we're going that way though, make it a high end ginger ale, make it like a Fever Tree or something. They don't sponsor me. It's just my go-to ginger ale or ginger beer for a cocktail. Make it a good one.
You're absolutely right about that, and I wasn't denigrating the drink, but yes,
sure.
We use out of I think it's out of South Carolina. We use Blenheim ginger ale, hot, spicy, craft made, sort of a small batch ginger ale with a zest of lemon. And I usually don't do citrus much with that drink, but that is one of our more popular cocktails in the bar. Is you get Conviction, you get a really well made, interesting, spicy ginger ale. And at that point, the whiskey, you're absolutely right. At that point, the bourbon becomes the sweet component. It becomes the balance component to the ginger spice. And it really, really is good. And that's a good catch on your part. I'm glad to hear that serious whiskey people still like to have that kind of drink, because the bubbles and the spice, it all works together really well. And a good bourbon can work in that.
Absolutely. And I do also want to point out, and this is an element of bottle design that to me feels very thought out in terms of where you want this to sit. If you want to sit on a first shelf, second shelf, not necessarily on the top shelf, but something approachable. The way the bottles are designed, they're rectangular bottles, relatively tall, but not so much that, you would have to put it on top shelf because it doesn't fit anywhere else. And if you put them, what's the best way to describe this? If you put them so they're, the vertical, obviously, but if you put them so that the shorter side is facing outward, it's very simple. You can see it from across the room that it's Conviction Small Batch Straight Bourbon Whiskey, Uncut, Unfiltered, or Conviction Double Oak 1929. These are very easy to read labels. And because they're rectangular bottles, they're going to fit well on a shelf that doesn't need to be super deep. It's not a huge round bottle or something with a large base that's going to take up a ton of space and thus lose the retailer valuable space on a shelf. So I just wanted to point that out as an element that I thought was really well done.
Thank you. And that did take a redesign, because actually the first few labels that we mocked up, we got to thinking that if you got a bar, shelf space is valuable, and we're asking someone to give us that valuable space that they pay rent and churn revenue off of. And if you turn the bottle sideways, we're asking them for a little less shelf space. We want them to see everything about the product that's relative to a purchase decision, even on the side label. So that's another good catch on your part. That was it was kind of trial and error at first, but you can turn ours sideways and put it on the bar, and both the bartender and the customer can see everything about it that would make you think you want to drink it. And it takes up you have to commit a little bit less of your footprint on the bar to us. You could probably get 3 of ours in the space of 2 of ours if you turn them all sideways.
Yeah, I was thinking exactly that. You could do 3 frontwise, or sorry, 2 frontwise or 3 on the side, and
right.
Same amount of space. And yeah, it's small that a lot of drinkers are not going to think about. But nothing against the Willet pot still bottle, but that is a real hell to put on a shelf for people because it takes up so much room. So I know we're also kind of doing the production side of things backwards, if you will, but I think that works in this case as part of the design. So I wanted to highlight the barrel influence. So in addition to being a cocktail forward, a spirit for a spirit forward cocktail, a bourbon for, I'm just going to restate that. In addition to being a bourbon for a spirit forward cocktail, these are also ones that are pretty intriguing for me on the Cooperage side of things and on wanting to highlight the barrel influence. Now, longtime listeners will know, or if you listen to probably 1 or 2 episodes, you'll know I hate woodiness in my whiskeys. Doesn't matter where they're from. I don't like feeling like I'm drinking a wood stave. And these, I don't get that at all. There was no woodiness. Having said that, there's plenty of barrel influence, and I love that. So these are, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, this is from when you were on Distiller's Talk with Alan Bishop. So you've got, let's see, a medium toast and a heavy char on all your barrels.
Yes, sir.
And you're, as we said earlier, the mash bill, 88% corn, 12% malted barley. So there is no rye in there. There's no wheat in there. So no rye for ostensibly the spice, although my colleague Steve Coombs might dispute that. And no wheat for kind of that quote unquote smooth, caramelly kind of note. And you said when you were talking with Alan and Christy that you really count on the wood and the char to add a little of that kick and those baking spice and spicier notes that normally, let's say, you would get from a rye. So I'd love to hear how your Cooperage profile came to be.
Again, we were sort of hit or miss, and we did some medium char, some sort of char 3 stuff early. I've always liked a heavier char, especially for a single barrel product, because I think I think it's like anything else, the more you cook it, the more you bring out in it. And I think that when you do a heavier char on wood, even meticulously precise processes will yield a little different the more of anything that you do. And I think that applies. And I'm not an expert on the Cooperage side. I just sort of know my end of what those barrels are able to do for us. We spend a lot of time on our tours and with our staff. Wood impact, cast finishing, double oaking, the barrel stagger, all of these things are things that are well thought through and well sort of bantied about both on staff and with our guests on our tours, especially our barrel house tastings. For me, the difference, I think the more you char a barrel, the more difference you'll get barrel to barrel. And we're not really doing a lot of blending. So it's okay for something to be distinctive and to be different as long as it's good. We talk about the single barrel experience. It's not supposed to be the same. It's all supposed to be good. And we do that with our barrels. I think the toasting really helps set those compounds into the char. It pulls them to the surface and then blisters them there. And you're correct. Our high corn, we get mid-tier dark sweets. We get toffee, we get honey, we get brown sugar and caramel. We get the sweets and we get the mouthfeel out of our grain bill. And then we let the wood do sort of fill in those other gaps. We let the spiciness that some of ours have on the back, that has a little bit of a pepper scratch, that's like a light rye might be. It's from the tannins in the wood. And when ours get woody or smoky, which some people like and some people don't, that's coming from the wood. That our template is corn, and then the barley provides that sort of cereal baseline warmth and graininess. And then we provide the sweets and the mouthfeel with the heavy corn. And then we kind of let the wood do its thing. We say all the time, trust the wood, trust the wood. We work really hard in fermentation. We pay meticulous care in distillation. And then after that, it belongs to the wood for the next 4, 5, 6 years. And, that's what you taste when you taste our products. The difference in the barrels is the difference in the wood. And some wood is great at 4 years. We found out some bottles that we've put up at 4 years are great. Some of them aren't. We let them sit. It's we never force dump one. I always tell people that bourbon has value in two places. That's in the barrel and in the cash register, and it should spend as little time in between those 2 points as possible. So we don't harvest until we get orders to fill. We run out of stuff and then go pick another one. We don't do these mass dump bottle days and that sort of stuff. But the wood for us is a key component. It's not just a storage vessel. It is a key component. The wood is dialed in to match sort of what our grain bill doesn't bring to the table. We have set a barrel stagger that we think will sort of fill in those spaces with wood, and we let corn do the heavy work on the front of the pallet.
I really think it's done very, very well, and this goes for both products that I've gotten to try. I was just quickly looking back at my tasting notes, and the funny thing that I thought about was there are plenty of brands that do a toasted finish, if you will. So not necessarily toast, and I'm talking about even if they do a slight toast and then a 3 char or 4 char for their regular maturation, they'll do an additional toasted barrel at the end with either no char, minimal char. You're not doing that. You're doing a heavy char, a medium toast. So these are flavors that are going to come through immediately. And a couple of things popped out. Number one, when you look at these products in a bottle as well as in a glass, they are dark. We're talking extra dark maple syrup, whatever grade A that is, or grade A plus. I wish I knew more about maple syrup at this moment. But something really dark, like salted pretzel crusts, were these dark kind of fruit molasses where it's not totally opaque, but there's it's dark but clear. These are all things that came to mind as I was drinking them. They also come across with this mouthfeel that is just shy of syrupy. You can see it when you pour into the Glencairn or the glass that it's got some viscosity to it, which personally I love. I mouthfeel is the number one determinant of whether I'm going to like something or not, even more so than flavor. So for me, both of those, they hit the mark. Now, the this toasting profile, as not to belabor this point, but especially with a double oak, you're talking about two separate toasted and charred casks. You're, in the double oak, you're rebarreling after I think 2 or so years into the second cask. So again, it's another price point that you have to factor into these things. So again, I'll ask. I understand you're looking for that flavor, but also to still remain in that area where it can be even an elevated cocktail. And do you find that that's also kind of a tenuous balance?
We do, and of course, any time that you double oak, if you're going new wood to new wood, you're committed to twice the wood cost per
Sure.
bottle, whatever your per bottle or per gallon, however people do their call sheets. That once you say we're going to do a double oak, that means that you're going to do a double wood cost per unit. Period. So you kind of you figure that in when you go, and then you do the margin after that. It's for us, and I love people who love to talk about the barrel impacts, because it's the one thing I've noticed doing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tastings with people is the thing that even as consumers become very sophisticated about mash bills and distillation regimes and the different kind of stills, as they learn all of that, there's still a gap in education with consumers on wood treatment. That is one thing that is so incredibly fascinating, that I think that even sophisticated bourbon consumers are still catching up to that. And I think that's the next sort of, and a big company see that coming, and they're doing all of these neat things with different barrels and different stays and what have you. For us, you seem to be the kind of person that would be interested in this. We have a rule for our double oak, and that is that it stays in the second barrel longer than it was in the first barrel. And that is a really, really different thing. A lot of people will take a fully aged, really good bourbon and do a relatively quick second barreling. And some of those products are outstanding. I'm not putting down what other people do. For us, for our products, for our barrel stagger, what we find is that a really young second barrel, a short exposure to the barrel, actually brings down the quality of the spirit, in the same way that when you put fresh distillate, when you put new make corn liquor in a barrel, it actually tastes worse 2 or 3 months in than it tasted coming out of the still. Barrels are a violent, acrid environment before the spirit hits them. And we've sort of surmised that the wood's not only treating the bourbon, but the bourbon is treating the wood. And the interplay between spirit and wood works in both directions in the early 2 or 3 years of aging. So we would never want to take a 4-year-old bourbon, double oak it for 6 months, because then you're tasting 6-month-old wood in this 5-year-old bourbon. And I would rather taste 3-year-old wood in my 5-year-old bourbon. I don't want to back up the benefits of aging to the wood by selling the wood young, no matter how old the bourbon is. It's a completely different philosophy than what most people do. And it may have something to do specifically with our grain bill and with our barrel stagger. We don't do a different second barrel stagger. We get one barrel and we use it both times. So one barrel setup, and we use it in both barrels. So there may be something just in the specifics of what we do that make that work better for us. But with age mattering and with years on wood mattering, I think it matters that for us that second barrel not be some green, juvenile, unseasoned wood that we're going to drink off of. So that's how we process our double oak. And it may just be my stinginess that I hate to use a barrel for 6 months and then throw it away. At least this way it sits around. It sits around for a couple of years. We get to show it to people and say we've got this many barrels. So it may be driven as much by that as anything else, but we think it works for us and for that product.
I think that's a point I hadn't thought of, which is you do get, you have the additional initial doubling cost, but if you're, like you said, if you're using it for longer than the first maturation, let's say, in the first barrel, then at the same time, you're not losing the cost like you would if it was just for 6 months and then you got to get rid of it or something like that. So no, I think that's a valid point on that for sure. And as we're kind of going through the product as well, I wanted to ask you about this, and we'll go into another topic on this, which is, so you're entering at 105 proof for all but the Founder's Reserve, as you said. As it happens, both products that I received came out in the bottle at 102.6 proof. So you're just barely losing, 2.5 points of proof on there, 1.5 percentage points of ABV. And I wanted to ask about that, especially in the context of the North Carolina climate. Because again, it's a place we haven't visited or talked about before on the podcast. So are you finding that that's pretty much how most of your barrels are coming out after a few years, that it's pretty stable from barrel entry to barrel dumping?
I really didn't notice that today until I pulled up our tasting notes for the bottles that I knew you had in hand. And that's, I don't want to mislead anyone to think anything we do is that precise. So that was coincidence more than precision. We have several aging spaces that do different things. We've got an old 1929 solitary confinement hot box that it gets super hot in there and it drives out alcohol and it changes the profile a little bit. But in our main barrel house, what we're finding is about between 101 and 106 would probably be 85 or 90% of our harvest point. And but we will get some outliers, and I love the outliers on the north end. But for me, the best, they're unique. And when you're like me and you drink too much, the ones that stand out are the ones that are different than all the rest of it, I think. But we pulled a 113 and a 118 at different times that were so just because just the little kick in proof is kind of where I live. And they were fantastic. The stuff coming out of the hot box, people who like things that are a little lower proof in the 98, 99 range, they love them because they're lighter, they're sweeter, they're vanilla forward. So the different aging spaces can manipulate that a little bit. As far as the weather here is concerned, I will tell you something that's very interesting. I wish we were smart enough to check it before we moved in, but we've checked it since. If you take if you've been anywhere, and I'm sure you have, anywhere you go in the world, they got two things on the bar from America. They've got Jack Daniels and they've got at least one, if not 10 bourbons from the Louisville, Bardstown, Lexington area. Those are the two great American spirits worldwide. If you do all of the math from the National Weather Service with average daily highs, average daily lows, temperature variance, humidity, year over year, we are in the exact average between Lynchburg, Tennessee, and Lexington, Kentucky. So we are, from a climatic standpoint, where we are where people have been making great whiskeys for centuries in very similar climatic conditions. So the weather here is just as you would expect or feel anywhere that you go that they make great bourbons. And that's because of that, all we have to do is open the doors and windows and let the thing happen. We don't have to spend a lot of time worrying about, getting too hot, getting too cold, whatever. What works in those other great whiskey regions is working for us at the same time.
It's, yeah, I mean, it again, it just interested me because I agree that it was coincidence that these two bottles happen to be the same proof. I didn't think there was anything intentional in that, but the when you compare yourself to the, as you said, those two kind of centers of bourbon and whiskey production, I I think in a way we're kind of conditioned as bourbon drinkers to think that bourbons coming out from those places are going to be higher proof if they have aged for a while. Because I mean, a lot of them are going in at 125 as opposed to 115, 110, 105 or lower. So they're already starting out at a pretty high proof point. And I take, for example, Jack Daniel's single barrel goes into 125. They're coming out at 126 to 130 on in most cases, which yeah, it's higher. It's a hell of a proof point for sure, but it's actually not that different from the entry proof. So I see what you're saying in that it's, you can draw that through line between where you are and the averages, and it would fit in. And for me, I think there's something about the lower proof point. It just concentrates the flavor more. There's, you don't have to add more water at the end. I mean, you're not adding water anyway. It's uncut, unfiltered, but you don't have to. There's not as much water to begin with either, and the water is getting the same wood treatment as the whiskey is. So it's not just adding distilled water at the end. It's much better overall.
And that was your point earlier was very true, that at the lower proofs you need more barrels. Uh, for us, part of the experience we wanted to create was if you walked into our distillery and you poke a hole in a barrel, or you thiefed out of the barrel and you tasted it directly from the barrel, it should taste exactly the same way when you get it home. That we don't show you the barrel and then dump a bunch of water in it and then sell it to you in the bottle. That if you want to know what bourbon tastes like the minute it comes out of the barrel, drink Conviction, and that's exactly what all of it tasted like the day the barrel was harvested. I had on a tour, I had a young woman. She wasn't even a whiskey drinker. She was there with her family, and we were explaining this low entry proof, high entry proof stuff, and she blurted out in the middle of the taste, and she said, "Oh, you're aging the water too." And I was like, "Yes, you're the smartest person in the room. That is exactly what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than introducing filtered water late, we're putting it in early and letting it all age and commingle and coalesce together, and then that's the product you get in the bottle."
That goes to your point as well about letting the barrels have their influence and do a lot of the work. Because if you have that extra water in there from the start as opposed to adding it at the end, that water, in addition to being flavored by the wood, is interacting with the wood and creating flavor compounds and degrading others that alcohol will not. It's taking water soluble compounds out that alcohol is just going to leave in there, or at worst, kind of burn them off, if you will. And when you're already talking about a heavy char barrel to start with, I almost think that if you put too high, and this is why I'm really curious about the Founders Reserve, like if you were to put 125 proof in there, how the barrel reacts in such a way that it doesn't just obliterate the barrel by nature of being so hot.
Right.
But that's for another conversation as well. So just for the sake of time, because I there are so many things to ask about here, and I want to definitely get to the prison part of this, which is still I find fascinating as well. I wanted to do two more things on the process, and one of them was that in addition to letting the wood and the barrels do their thing and really add all that flavor, when you were talking with Alan and Christy, you said the yeast you're using, it's Red Star right off the shelf, very popular distilling yeast around the country, if not around the world. The grain is local when possible, but you're not necessarily going for like a heritage grain or a specific varietal. It's more about letting the grain flavors be there to enter the wood and then letting the wood work. There was one part of that process that I wanted to ask about, which was that you described it as macerating the corn. And I wasn't sure if that was just for the moonshine or if that applied to the bourbon too, but I wanted to ask you about that part of the process.
Yeah, we have one fermentation, we have one grain bill, one fermentation regime, one distillation regime. Every product we have is exactly the same until it gets into processing. So just that what I like to do is, fermentation takes 6 or 7 or 8 days, whatever that takes, and as long as that's active, we leave it alone. But once we lose the float, once we have the grain bed on the bottom, the yeast beds on the bottom, things have settled out, there's no more fermentation taking place, I like to leave the grain in the liquid, in the mash, in the wash. I like to leave the grain in for 48 hours because under our fire codes here, we can't distill on the grain with our setup. So we have to separate the wash from the grain. And what I want to do is I want to macerate the corn. I'm not just looking for alcohol. I'm looking for graininess. I'm looking for corniness. And I think that one of the best ways to do that is after fermentation is over and you've got your ABV set for your wash, let it sit for a couple of days and just soak up what's left of the corn that isn't alcohol. And I think that goes a long way to giving us a really hearty, cereally base graininess for our wash that carries through everything else we do. And it also kind of blows the corn out a little bit and makes it a little bit easier to get that last gallon or two of wash out of the fermenter. But for me, remembering that we're not just chasing alcohol, that we're also chasing the flavor of the grain itself. And like any maceration, giving it a 48 hours more, when the fermentation has stopped and everything is resting in its space, turn it around a little bit, stir it a little bit, and then let it sit for another couple of days. You get a much better corniness flavor in your wash than if you just dump it the day the last bubble comes to the surface.
That's true. I like it. And it pulls out more of those starches too, and the corn starches, and they add flavor. And particularly, as you said, if you can't distill on grain, which I figures you have the internal heating coil mechanism, so the grain would probably just burn if the solids
Correct.
were in there.
Correct.
So if you have to pull off the wash or the wort, which depending on where you're from, it makes sense. Take every ounce of starch and alcohol you can get and flavor you can get before you remove the grain. So I like it. With that, let's talk about the prison. So I want to start with something you said earlier, which was that when you started up, this includes your original location and where you are now at the prison, you said the community around them was pretty welcoming when you had the idea of bringing a distillery in. And I was curious if you have any thoughts on, I guess, why they were so welcoming, or did you expect a different response, let's say?
When you're in this business, you always, expect some blowback for the trade you're in. Not everybody loves it or loves the people who make it, and that's fine. We started in Concord, North Carolina, in a very small space. We were just doing the corn whiskey, and we were just sort of doing runs and bottling to ship. And the city of Concord and all of Cabarrus County was very welcoming and encouraging. The business community was very supportive. Local press was very supportive. We've only had positive experiences locally in the life of our company. The original move was facilitated by the need for barrel space. We were co-tenants with other businesses in our original location, and nobody else in the building could get insurance because of the business we were in. So we needed a space that was conducive to storage of bourbon for years on end. So we kind of put together a little site search and visited different communities, and Mount Pleasant, North Carolina, and was just lavish in their welcome and acceptance of us. And a Mount Pleasant resident, Dr. Alan Dobson, he's the chairman of our board. now, and he facilitated the financing for the facility. His one of his real estate companies ended up buying the facility and doing the upfits and leasing it back to us, and really made it possible in a way that would never have been possible for us to make the leap into bourbon production. So when I always am effusive about how welcoming we were, it was not that anybody else was particularly mean to us. It's that community and a business leader in that community got on board and made the expansion of the company into bourbon a possibility in a way that most likely would not have been otherwise. And it has continued. The local are regular customers. Like I say, Dr. Dobson has become a part owner and chairman of the company, and has brought to bear resources and connections and ideas that we would not have had access to otherwise. So if I seem happy about it, I am. I like the chairman of the company. I like the landlord. I don't like many people. I was glad that that's the same guy. Yes, because I only have to like one guy to like both of those slots. But it's it has worked for us. And sometimes when you go to a small community, you can have a bigger impact sooner. We are drawing tourists to Cabarrus County and to Mount Pleasant in a way that is recognized by that community as being a positive, and that's that makes it a little more fun when you get a sense that the people around you are glad you're there.
For sure. And the prison itself. So I again, just for time's sake, I know we could go into the real deep details of the prison. We'll ask about a few things. You went into a really great job with Alan Bishop, like I said, as well as from a totally different angle, Graveyard Tales, which just came out in August of this year. So that was a lot of fun to listen to as well, to hear about the paranormal side of things and the things you kind of think of when you think about a prison. You know, there are going to be things left behind, especially closed prisons. The angle that I wanted to ask you about was, so it's not a prison that was closed for a long time. You know, it's built in 1929, expanded in the 80s, and then closed just in 2011. And then you guys moved in Labor Day of 2016. So just for argument's sake, let's say 5 years elapsed. When you were going through this process, you knew you had to move for those insurance reasons, for the other companies. You wanted more barrel storage space. You wanted to expand. Once you've decided, okay, this is going to be the place where we're going to move to, what kind of renovations did you have to do? What kind, did you find any usable facilities that were kind of move-in ready?
We really didn't. The prison was the tourism draw of the prison was the thing that was head and shoulders above any other facility that we looked at, including pricing out just building a standalone facility somewhere. So that the revenue potential and the marketing potential for Whiskey Prison is it has worked. It was a great idea, and that was kind of the draw. It was not an ideal, as you can imagine. It was not an ideal modern production facility. So we kind of we had to, they knocked down some walls and had to run some water and wires, because they really don't have a lot of running water and electrical outlets and conduit and all of those sorts of things in prison dorms. I tell people that the 1929 Wi-Fi is still in play out there, but we've kind of we've navigated that, and it's for whatever we've given up for sort of the convenience of a modern production facility, the character of the place and the interest in the facility itself and lending itself to the marketing of the product has more than offset the sort of, we wish the ceilings were 2 feet higher, or we wish there was a door somewhere else. It's just we can people make great corn liquor in the woods. We can certainly make it in that building, and that's just it's been a really really good experience having these other. We have people that want to get married out there. We have people that want to spend the night out there. We have people who just want to do and be part of the facility who aren't bourbon enthusiasts, and that's great for us. It gives us another entry point into people's sort of recreational lives, and we can matter in a way other than in a glass of whiskey, and we love to do that.
Love it. I will say, I think if I love the idea of having people who want to get married there, people who want to spend the night there. I think if you're going to get married and spend the night there, that's probably a different license. So, people don't get ahead of yourselves. So with these facilities, you mentioned earlier about the hot box in particular being a solitary confinement solitary confinement cell, and a specific aging area that ages differently. Now, looking at the larger scale, in the block that you use for maturation for the majority of your barrels, what does the aging look like in there? We're talking racks, pallets. What's the environment like?
In the larger space, we barrel everything. We're horizontal, bung on the side, and we just have that you would recognize them as traditional barrel racks. Our staff builds those with 4x, and we're racked for. We're not very high. I think that we're racked 4 high. So we don't really rotate barrels because there's not a lot of temperature variance,
right,
floor to ceiling, the way people that are 30 or 40 or 50 feet high really have internal temperature variance. We really don't. Windows all around the facility. I mean, we get the ventilation we need. When the barrels weren't in there, it was just an empty brick modular space. We had to cut down 2 stands of prison bars so we could move our lifts and barrels in and out of the building. But other than that, it looks just the way it does, the day we moved in. And our guys built the racks in, and we've got a manual lift in there, and they put them in and take them out the hard way. But once we put them in, we leave them there and don't mess with them.
All right. I like it. You're right. I mean, if you got four ricks high, you're not going to need to go moving barrels around. It's going to be more trouble than it's worth probably at that point.
Yeah.
And again, like I said, we're kind of almost skimming the concept of distilling in a prison just for time's sake and because others have done it so well. But I really encourage people to look at those other episodes as well, if they want to know more about this, and to visit. And you can do a paranormal tour. You can do, but I also want to. So with the tour aspect and the tourism aspect, before we finish off with the kind of future of Southern Grace Distilleries, I wanted to ask in particular about one of your tours, the age progression tasting. So this is a tour you can do and you get to taste over the course of 2+ hours from raw distillate to 6-year-old bourbon. You're going through all the production points. And you even say in the description, which I found both hilarious and useful, recommended for serious bourbon fans.
Yes. I'm how it is when you're a fanboy and a nerd. It's really interesting if you find other nerds and fanboys. It is the most boring experience of your life if you don't care about it. This is the first time we've done this. We, of course, do it ourselves. We check the trajectory of our barrels, and we've done this. We do it all the time, and we've had several of our regular customers who are serious bourbon drinkers. They're like, we can taste all the different products, but there's really not many places to go to do this. What is the trajectory of aging spirits through that process? And so I'm gonna do that one this Saturday as part of our anniversary weekend. We've still got 4 or 5 slots open for it, I think, but we're gonna do that, and we're gonna go through, and we're gonna actually let the people on the tour feed some of the samples, and we're going to drill and stave some barrel heads, probably going to do some proof work as well, sort of a hands-on And not all of it, of course, is going to be the best bourbon you've ever tasted, because some of it's going to be 6 or 9 months old. But that's the point:
Mhm.
is that this is coming out of the still. This is 6 months on wood. This is a year and a half on wood, all the way out to a 6.5 year, to really drive home this point that the wood is doing its work, and for people who love it and are interested in it at that level, I hope it'll be a good experience, because it's not there's a good reason that there's not a lot of 6 month old bourbon on the market. But in this context, I think it's interesting to see what 6 month old bourbon tastes like versus the next year, the next year, and the next year.
No, totally agree. I mean, this is a tour that I would happily, I mean, that's the one I would sign up for or ask for, frankly, if it wasn't on offer publicly, to see, as you said, where things are going. That's exactly what I want to see. So with that, and just, moving into our last kind of segment here. Uh, oh, actually, I'm sorry. There was one more question I had on that, which was when you were on the Amuse Bouche podcast, this was 3 years ago or so. You said something that I want to ask about, and this has to do with the tastings and tours, which was that when you're tasting whiskey, if I heard you right, it said you don't chew your whiskey. As chewing the whiskey, that Kentucky chew kind of thing, could create a different experience than what most drinkers will actually get. So it's not representative, really. So first, can I just like confirm that that's what you were talking about?
Yes, that is something, and again, we all experience and evaluate things differently. And I was asked what I do and don't do, I believe, and
Mm.
I don't do it. I think that the tasting, especially if it's an evaluative taste, if you're comparing two barrels to pick, or if you're, as you've done, if you're working on tasting notes of a spirit in a way that you want to take it apart and talk about it intently as it's moving through your mouth, I think the better way to do that is in a deliberate, natural drinking motion, rather than some agitative process that's really not the way anybody would drink it. I understand some people think that that will free up components that they can evaluate that way. They're free to continue to do it that way. I prefer to do it another way. And something else that I do when I'm judging a whiskey is I really believe the draw is important, the fifth stage, that residual palate. And I think if you've sort of gargled with it and scattered it all over your mouth, you're creating a false impression on the fifth stage. I want it to be a residual palate of a normal sip. So I kind of trade off whatever the benefits are for chewing on it to leave to protect what I consider to be the integrity of the draw.
No, I think that makes sense. When I was thinking about it, I heard that point after I had already tasted the bourbons, and um, honestly, I didn't have to do a chew on them because they were so viscous and had so much flavor to begin with. So I didn't think it needed that enhancement that sometimes, I agree, sometimes the chew can give. Um, the question I think came out of it for me was, if you're sending a sample or a bottle to someone to review, or let's say that the consumer who's buying it is, I don't know how else to put it, like is more likely to do that kind of chew or drink it. Do you want to advise or advise reviewers or consumers to evaluate your whiskeys a different way, or do you want to say, like, look, this is how I drink it and how I'm intending it, and either way it's going to come out fine?
That's a conversation that we have around the tasting table with our customers and our guests, is that this is how I do it and this is why I do it that way. I always tell people it's not your obligation to find a way to like conviction. It's conviction's obligation for you to enjoy it no matter what you do with it. So this is how you smell, and this is how you taste, and this is how you spit, and this is how you rinse. I don't care. Do what you do, and if you don't like it, drink something else. It's my job to make it to where you'll like it, and I trust people, even people who are different from myself to decide if they like it or not. And that means do whatever you do with it when you decide, whatever makes you decide you like Weller or you like Jack Daniels or you like, Oban, whatever made you decide you like that, put us through the same paces and see if you like us.
Fair enough. And I could ask you that question of why Oban was the one that came to mind for you, but we'll skip it for now.
It's sitting here. It's
I figured it was either in front of you or it's got to be one of your favorites. So
no, it's just it's at arm's length. So
fair, all good. So again, looking to the future as we end the episode, which it's been really fun talking to you. I really enjoyed it. As we said, this weekend, as of recording, you're going to be celebrating your 10th anniversary. When you were on with Alan back in January, you said you were, you're in the heart of apple and peach country. You might do a brandy at some point, might do a gin at some point. What do you think comes next as you enter your second decade?
The first thing we want to do is to expand bourbon production, whether that means another still, bigger fermenters, another human, whatever it means. It's for 10 years to figure out what we're doing and to find out if we're doing it right. And if there's a potential in the market, we think there is. We think there needs to be more conviction in the pipeline. So that's kind of number one. I've always dreamed of replacing the small still, our first still that's been in consistent use for 10 years, is converting it to some sort of a seasonal brandy kind of a thing. That's a personal thing. I don't know when we'll get there. We want to keep making the corn liquor and the bourbon as good as we can and stay focused on that. And then the first expansion would be to make more bourbon. And then the next thing after that would be to venture into those other spirits. I can't help but think that an apple brandy aged in a bourbon barrel would almost have to taste good. But again, that's not official. That's just me.
No, I can say I've had a few of those, apple brandies finished in bourbon. They are quite good. Similarly finished in rye casks. I know that's not obviously what you guys are producing, so that might be out of the cards for the moment, but no, the flavors match really well, and particularly given the flavors you already have present in the Conviction Small Batch and Double Oak 1929, perhaps even more so in the Double Oak. I think an apple brandy finish in that would be in that second use cask would be just fantastic. So yeah, that's where we are. I will have tasting notes for these up. I again really enjoyed them. Thomas, hang out for me for just a minute after we finish recording.
Sure.
And with that, thank you so much to Thomas Thacker for coming on, talking about Southern Grace Distilleries in Mount Pleasant, North Carolina. Listen to the show notes and the end of this episode for anything else you might find. We'll have links to where you can purchase from Southern Grace Distilleries, where you can find their products, and where you can follow them on social media to know all things that are coming up and coming down the pike. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and I will see you all next week.